Here goes nothing. Hi. This presentation is on how to make homemade donuts. If you're expecting something else, you might be in the wrong place. How to suck at porting a Drupal 8 module. Folks, I have plenty of experience with this. My name is Adam Bergstein. You are at the Baltimore Drupal camp, hopefully on October 9th, 2015, but that's been debated. A little bit of background about me. First, I live in Pennsylvania. I'm not from Baltimore. I have friends down here. It's an easy drive. I said, why not? I've been using Drupal since about when Drupal 6 came out. It's about when I started. I'm currently switching jobs. Today is my last day at Acquia. I'm going to Civic Actions, so I'm spending it here with you.
Nice.
A little bit of background about me. So I've been working with Drupal 8 for about a year and a half now. I've been pretty heavily involved with it at Acquia from my team. I've been doing a lot with hands-on learning, trying to get people up to speed on what it is, how to use it, et cetera, so on. I've also contributed a lot to strategic initiatives around porting modules and documentation. Not necessarily on Drupal.org. We're working on some stuff at Acquia, things like that. And I've ported a bunch of contrib modules myself. So you can't really get involved with something without actually getting your hands dirty, right? So what have I done? Well, first, I'm actually writing a book. The book is called Problem Solving with Drupal 8. It's going to be focused on generic web-related problems in Drupal 8 and how to solve them. It's not earth-shattering. It's not a development-focused book. It's more for site builders. I've ported taxonomy menu, services module, which isn't quite released yet, password policy, encrypt key, field encrypt, web forms. I'm just beginning. We're working with the maintainers on that. And I developed a Drupal DevOps system, hang on one second, that works on basically setting up and staging projects for Drupal 8. Yeah?
Can we shut doors?
Absolutely. Cool. I still need to come up with a name for that system, though. It's a little bit like Drush. It's a little bit like Drupal console. I haven't really figured out where it kind of lands yet. Why I sucked at porting? Well, first and foremost, hey, I'm a developer by trade. I have a computer science background. I've got a master's degree from Penn State. So I'm like, hey, you know what? Like, I got this. I'm going to just freaking dive in. I'm going to be awesome. I've worked a lot in Drupal 7. I've got all those concepts down. I'm just going to freaking dive right into this. That was a mistake. So learning through just getting beat up constantly, right? So I think that's really why I'm presenting today. And this talk will cover some of the challenges I face. It's not meant to be comprehensive. It's not meant to be in-depth. It's meant to be more broad. It's to give you guys some just topics and things to research and look into. And that's what we're going to do. So how can you suck at doing this? Well, first, I don't understand the Drupal 8 features. That's a really easy way to suck, right? If you can't build a module or port a module, if you don't actually understand what is in the system. That sounds obvious. But again, and we already talked about this, sometimes as technologists, we say, oh man, I just want to get my hands dirty with some code. I want to get in there and start messing around. But read the manual. Just take the 20 minutes and read the overview of what it is. You will be much better off because of it, trust me. And one thing that I think is interesting is between 5 and 6 and 6 and 7, there were architectural changes, but the main part of Drupal still persisted, right? The same procedural system, the hook system, everything like that, the modules. Guess what? Drupal 8, totally different. So read up on it before you do anything. And listen to my talk, because it's hopefully good. All right. I don't understand the D8 design pattern. So, okay, you read this stuff. Now you're going to all right, I want to jump in. Well, hang tight. You cannot make the correct architectural choices when you're porting something if you don't know what choices exist. You could go down a path that would be wildly off. And it might work, but is it right? Who knows? So you need to be able to understand what choices you have at your discretion before you start coding, right? Makes sense. So there's a lot of big changes. First and foremost, object orientation. Huge, huge, huge modernization from 7 to 8 is everything. Most things are object-based. It's not procedural. You're not writing callback functions anymore. You're not doing a lot of the same design patterns that you were using to write Drupal 7. You're just not. It is much more modern. It adopts concepts that are found in PHP 7, which isn't even released yet. So, it's pretty cool. There's a lot of core provided interfaces and utilities and all these things that you guys are used to probably from 7 that would be, functions that are delivered from core. But now they're interfaces. They're objects. They're new. And they're not named the same way. And there's a lot more of them. So it becomes totally crazy. So what are some buzzwords that you guys probably need to be familiar with to start speaking this language? Well, you got to get up to speed on PSR 0 and 4, understand the autoloading concepts. Get up to speed on what a controller is, what a service is, what a kernel is. These are foundational concepts to Drupal in Drupal 8. Next, I don't understand Symfony. Well, just like understanding Drupal 8 architecture, Drupal 8 heavily leverages Symfony. If you don't want to learn Drupal 8 architecture, you can't avoid Symfony then. You have to figure it out. Why not get up to speed on Symfony? It'll make your life easier. You'll understand exactly how core is built. You'll understand exactly what's going on with the core provided interfaces. And most of Symfony, if not all of it, is object-oriented. So you're kind of knocking out several birds with one stone. Drupal 8, conceptually, is a best-of-breed system. It's not a fully custom system any longer. They're bringing in tools from other open source projects to make it the best architecture it can be. They're not writing everything from scratch, which is what had happened with 5, 6, and 7. So it's a much different system than I think what people are kind of used to conceptually. And if you don't understand these Symfony concepts, you're going to really struggle to kind of get off the ground, right? Because they're sort of foundational to what is in Drupal 8. And what are some examples of that? Well, front-end and theming. Twig is sponsored by Symfony. There's core-sponsored design patterns like kernels, event subscribers, and services that are Symfony-based. That's how Symfony does things, right? And then there's core-provided utilities. There's the services interface, the translation functions, information around requests and responses that you guys need to understand to actually, develop, right? And the configuration system is heavily leveraging different parts of Symfony as well, like YAML. YAML is a big thing in the Symfony space. I don't understand the difference between content and config. Now this is kind of fun. So in Drupal 7, there was a lot of gray area between, say, database tables and content and storage, and then things like features, where you could export things to code. And that's how you kind of get your code into, or your configuration from a site into code, right? But there is a much more rigid line drawn in Drupal 8 that distinguishes between things that are considered content and things that are considered configuration. If you don't understand the difference between the two, you're done. So D8 has made so many vast improvements in the space of configuration management that you all would want to leverage, right? I mean, that's like major, major new feature. Super awesome in Drupal 8. But if you don't get like the difference between, say, a node that has content pieces associated to it or a piece of configuration that has exportable pieces of content, well, it's not content, but exportable pieces of YAML or configuration that you want to persist across your environments, you're going to really get sort of mixed up, right? So it's really important to understand exactly what configuration is and what content is inside of Drupal 8 and try to sort that out, because they have very different paradigms for those. And so Core provides a lot of tools that really help to kind of shuffle this, and we'll talk about entities later, so we'll get into that. But everything is really configuration friendly in Drupal 8, from entities to fields to views to configuration settings of modules, et cetera, and so on. That's all configurable via CMI. So you could dump that into a YAML file and move on your way. But a lack of understanding of these two different concepts can be very limiting. You'll really put yourself in a very bad place. This was a really, really cool one. I heard this from several people in the community when we were helping move this one module along. And I'm just trying to port D7 concepts. I just want my D7 module in D8 and have it work. I want to click the enable button, right? If there's one thing this presentation should tell you, D7 is not D8, period. They're two radically different systems, okay? You can make an incredibly thoughtful and lean and super awesome Drupal 8 module port if you leverage the tools the right way. I had taxonomy menu ported with about 1/5 of the code that was in the 7 version in about 4 days. That's a lot easier to maintain, isn't it? Right? But if you don't know how to get what you need to do it, you're going to build something that's super bloated and doesn't need to be. It's probably not right. So Core provides all these new design patterns, interfaces, and utilities. So what's the message? Really, if you're trying to copy and paste something from Drupal 7, put it into Drupal 8, that's not going to work out too well for you. D7 is very procedural. There's a lot of functions. There's a lot of things that get triggered and hooks. It's a lot different. So it's not going to really work out well. And if you do get it to work, you're probably missing out on things like CMI or translations or the plugin system, which can make your module really dangerous.
What is CMI?
Configuration Management Initiative. Next, I don't work within the community. So one would say, oh, I don't really care. I want to build my D7 module in D8, and I don't care what the community thinks. Well, there's a lot of irony here, right? Because you're leveraging Drupal. It was built by the community, but you don't want to really stay on the reservation. It's kind of weird, right? And things move really fast in Drupal land. So don't waste your time working in a vacuum. Work in the community. Leverage the community. Advertise your work in the community. Okay? Do it. Check the module page. If you want to do a port and you're like, I want to port this module over here. Well, check the page. See if there's work that's already going on. You may be able to pitch in and make it better. You may be able to patch it a little bit or add another feature that you think is useful, right? It's a really good way to learn. You don't have to write the whole stinking thing, And if a D8, port doesn't exist, put an issue in. Say, hey, I want to make a port, Advertise the work, advertise your interest. Make sure people know that you want to do that. And if something does exist, then make some patches. Test it, find things that break. Specifically with all the different betas and releases that are going on, things are breaking a lot, right? So you could find just using a module and trying to work on it to help stabilize it, is kind of cool, and you could write probably a pretty small patch and would be super useful. So another way to suck. I learned from blog posts in Drupal.org docs. Okay, you would say, wait, this kind of seems weird. So Drupal 8 has changed so fast over the course of, say, the last 6 to 8 months. The canonical sources of documentation have not been keeping up with the pace of development. So a lot of the things that you read, a lot of things that were published even a year ago on Drupal 8, like some company wants to get ahead and say, we're D8 leaders, we're huge advocates of Drupal 8. They've written a blog post that's a year old, and then half of the code's broken if you try to use it. Not cool, right? So you can't really leverage these things. You can kind of get some ideas, but you can't really rely on them. Same with Drupal.org. The docs have not been maintained. It's almost all focused on development right now. Those things will come. There's a release candidate that was put out, 2 days ago, right? Drupal 8. So, that's usually a markation line of hey, we're getting much more serious about this. So you should start to see the documentation on Drupal.org and other places start to really stabilize. But give it a little bit of time. Here's another fun one. I don't use anything until it's stable. Yes?
If we want to learn from a more up-to-date sources, what kind of sources?
I will get to that. Yes, okay. I promise.
Sure.
Yep. I will definitely help you with that. So here's another fun one. I heard someone say this. This was actually really interesting. I don't want to use this until it's stable. I don't even want to touch this. Well, guess what? You have a responsibility in helping it to be stable, guys. Come on, that's what open source is. You use it, you submit back to it, you say, hey, I found a problem. You don't have to code it, but even just discovering something is really cool, right? So Drupal 8 has so many awesome new features that you guys would just love. It's really cool, and just bite the bullet and start getting in and using it, really. It's worth it, trust me. Importing modules is a fantastic opportunity, not only for you to learn, it helps the community grow, and Drupal 8 becomes even stable while you're doing that and as you're learning. So there's plenty of opportunity here, and people need and they want help. So please, by all means, jump in. Just start hacking at things. What are some sucky examples? Well, so one night I had a few beers. I was watching the Pirates game or something and trying to relax a little bit. And I decided to explore the new block system. And I'm like, hey, I'm going to port the menu block module, right? There's a menu over here that exists. There's a new block system. I'm going to write the connector. I'm going to make the two talk to each other, right? Guess what? It was already there. I didn't even check. Stupid. And here's the really dumb thing. If I had done a Google search, there was a Drupal.org issue that said it had been moved into core. Oh, God, no. That was a waste of an evening. But I learned a lot from it. That was fun. I still have the repo set up. You guys can see it. I'm not, you can call my bluff. All right, more sucky examples. Procedural versus object orientation. Well, where do you put your code in Drupal 8? That's the million-dollar question. That's really the hardest thing to learn is where do you put your code? What interfaces do you need? What's in core that I should be taking advantage of, right? That's the hard part. So sadly, there's no magic bullet. It's nothing. There's nothing besides using it that you can gain that experience. I'm sorry, it's true. But with the notion of controllers and services and entities and their operations and different callback functions and hooks and all these other places that you can potentially put code, it gets pretty confusing, right? So one thing, though, is that really you should strive to always use object orientation if you can. If there's a way to do it with objects, it's the safest place to do it. That's what Drupal 8 is expecting. Now, what is an example that doesn't work? Well, first and foremost, when I was porting taxonomy menu, I had a custom PHP function callback called taxonomy menu build tree. Well, we already had a taxonomy menu entity. That build tree shouldn't have been a callback. That should have been a function of the entity. It should have been an operation that was tied to that class, right? So if you don't organize the code the right way, you actually create something that's more confusing. So build tree should have been in that entity because that's where it belongs. That's an operation for that entity. So it's a different way of thinking about things, right? So that's a sucky example on my part that I learned. Databases versus entities. Now, okay, Drupal 7 uses databases for nearly everything, right? If you want to code it, you're using the database API, you're putting in schemas, you're doing all these other things. But guess what? Drupal 8, radically different. Entities are pretty much, one of the most exclusive ways to build objects in Drupal now. So what does that mean? Well, entities have their own schema. That's defined with YAML. We'll be getting into a lot of this stuff. But what limitations, though? So we've got, if we use a database, we cannot take advantage of the configuration system of Drupal 8. Why? Because database content is not exportable. It's content, right? Remember we talked about content versus configuration? So if you want anything to persist or be able to put anything into code, you have to take advantage of CMI. And CMI and entities, they're like best buds. They love each other, okay? Now, CMI and database content, database tables, they don't like each other. They conflict because databases are intended for content only. So I'll give you an example. So when I was porting the password policy module, I did like this was the first one I ported. I'm like, oh man, I'm just gonna take all my D7 stuff and ship it into D8. It's gonna be happy. And I just made a bunch of these tables, right? And then I saw an issue come in the issue queue and it said, I want to be able to export password policy settings. And I'm like, damn. And that was a complete rewrite. All these database callbacks and these inserts and these updates and these select queries, all these things, gone. Fun, right? All right, who's my themers or my front end? Yeah, okay. So the whole render process of Drupal 8 has been enhanced to accommodate Twig templates. It's also been enhanced to accommodate plugins like the interfaces of Drupal. So it's a lot different too. It's actually more complex than in 7. I wish they would have cleaned it up. Man, I'm sorry. But so it still leverages render arrays. That's not going away. I hate render arrays, by the way. But it has a lot of new concepts for building markup, like things like there's render elements, there's field elements that have render attributes about them. And these are all these new interfaces, right, that are a part of Drupal 8. And all of those get stored under source elements. So you guys can search through any code in Drupal core. If you find a module that has source and elements in it, you can see exactly what it's doing. And we'll talk about that shortly. That gets back to your other question. And so there's a lot of different stuff. And blocks, instead of having like pre-processing functions, it's part of the class now. It's part of the block type. So it leverages its own interfaces and as a plugin almost to take advantage of that. It still uses hooks though. So if you need to like really get into something that's like runtime based, you would have to still leverage a hook to alter that. All right, so let's start at ground zero. What are concepts that we need to learn when we're doing any sort of a module? Do you guys like the memes? Are they too lame? I'm not getting any chuckles. You guys are just like stoic. All right. So your standard PHP code that's in, say, a Drupal 7 module. Well, yes, you still have a module file. And guess what that has? That only has hooks. Do you need a module file in Drupal 8? No. So, and what's the goal? Well, the goal is that, with all the objects that exist in your module, all the YAML files and configuration, the role of hooks and the role of any custom callbacks that you might absolutely have to write should be minimized. So you might not even need it. Install file. I don't think you need this either, but if, again, it's kind of the same Drupal 7 paradigm. If you're making a database table, if you have requirements, uninstall logic, same deal, okay? But there's no info file anymore. It's not PHP based. It's YAML based. We'll get to that shortly. Hooks. Hooks are only for runtime, only. Hooks were just freaking crazy in Drupal 7. There's a hook for everything, right? Override this, override that. No. There's objects now. You'll be using many, many more interfaces. You're not going to be hooking everything. The hooks are only for runtime events. Things that you cannot, you can't adjust through, code. It has to be like, there is a specific form alter that I need in this specific context that I want right here. Or a theme hook, right? So I'm checking for these conditions of this render. I want to change it and do that. It's runtime driven only. Again, this is drastically reduced because of classes. Classes give you a really good logical way to extend some things, specifically around plugins. We'll talk about plugins shortly. Objects and classes. All objects of a module, all classes are stored under the source directory, okay? There are plugins that extend core provided interface in predefined directories. If I want to build a form, I put that under source form. If I want to build an element, I put that under source element, right? So there's these different namespaces that it expects for my module. We'll get to that shortly. The idea of doing that basically is that you're providing a canonical place for for a module to build its own functionality, right? And so because Drupal knows that, you don't need to register it in an info file. You don't need to hook into it and say, oh, here's my custom thing over here. No, it's all done and auto-loaded based on the core provided interfaces. Kind of nice. So we've got these idea of these classes, which I kind of have stubbed out as plugins, but that term's probably not quite right. And auto-loading by location. But the annotated namespace is really important as well. So Drupal 8 and classes leverage comments like crazy. And it's not, like, to me, it was something that I was kind of uncomfortable with when I started because, I'm kind of like, I come from more of a traditional coding background. Comments are supposed to be comments. They're not supposed to influence or adjust functionality. Au contraire. Drupal 8 does not do that. So we have this idea of annotations, and annotations are things like namespaces, but they are meant to supply metadata about the class. And there's a very, very prescriptive and predefined way to annotate classes, and it's all defined on a class-by-class basis. And that has all the metadata that you need to say, hey, this is this type of a class, these are the settings for this class, and these are the things that you need. Another kind of idea of how you do registration. Services are a really big concept in Drupal 8, and there's only one registration model that I've used a lot, which is the services.yaml file. And that is where you register the different services that you're building for your module. An example of a service is like I ported encrypt. So there's an encryption service. Any module can use it, right? So that service has to be registered inside of a services.yaml file. And we'll talk about why that is the case and not auto-loaded like a lot of other stuff. Configuration via YAML. This is another really cool thing, right? So we talked about the static PHP files. We've talked about the hooks, right? Well, now we're getting into the configuration. So instead of doing things with an info file that's PHP based, or instead of writing an install hook that defines a bunch of things to set up and configuration to set and all this other crazy stuff like you used to do in 7, right? YAML and CMI makes all of this tremendously easier. So you basically dump your config into an install directory, config install in your module, put your YAML files in that you've exported. You don't even need to write them. And basically, it ships your config the minute you install your module. It's kind of nice, right? So there are different formats for YAML based on the type of configuration you're using, okay? So if you're doing settings, it can be very, very basic, like here's my settings, here's a couple fields and values. It's like key value pairs, right? But if you have entity schemas, which is YAML based, those are a lot more complex. So they have field types, they can have sequences, they can have, it's pretty, it's a lot more robust and a little bit more difficult to learn, but we'll get to that. So what are types of YAMLs that you can find? Well, you can find things like routes and actions and links in your module. You can also find your info file, which is metadata, right? So that's all YAML based. And then we have things like static permissions that are defined for your module. Those are also YAML. And services, like we talked about, the services.yaml file. That's how you register a service, a custom service that you've written for your module. Entities. Entities, all the things. Make everything an entity. You'll thank me later. These are best for system objects. Why? Well, look, they stay on the reservation, right? You get the CMI. You get the translation features of Drupal 8, which are awesome, by the way, and really well enhanced now that they're in core. You get everything that's in core if you do entities. I helped to port the services module, right? You should see what we're doing with that. You want to talk about crazy. We are exposing every single entity that's registered in the system and giving you a web service that you could tap into on top of it. That's pretty damn powerful. So do you want to use an entity? I hope so. I really do. But there are two types. There are two primary types of entities. There are content entities. There are configuration entities. Okay? There are two very different concepts. Here's why. Content entities, the metadata of the entity is exportable. The instances or the content is not. It's in a database. Configuration entities, the metadata is exportable and the instances are exportable too. So all the instances of your entity can be put into code and shipped through your environments. The entity schema, again, is YAML-based, and this is crazy, crazy different than your database schema. You could say, hey, I got a database schema. It's got, a text field and, a number, right? Nope. Nope, nope, nope. If you have an area that you want to really dig in on, try to figure out entity schemas. It's radically different than anything that's in 7. All right, so let's wrap up this exercise by doing a little case study and talk about what we just discussed, the dynamics of a module, right? First, we got the YAML, and that's where we define all the configuration around content types, taxonomy, Drupal settings, and module settings, right? That's all YAML-based now. We've got a module file, and that holds things like form hooks and theme hooks. We've got classes that are all stored under predefined directories under source. And that's when you're building a new form, a new entity, a new field type, or a controller. And then we've got these services and these interfaces that you can ship with your own module. And those are just under the source directory because there's no canonical place for them. They're brand new. So that might be like setting up an encryption service or a custom plugin system. Things that really, they don't exist yet because you're building them, right? All right, some pro tips. So how do you fix your suck? How do you do it? Let's figure it out. All right, first and foremost, get down the basics of these design patterns. I've thrown buzzwords at you the entire time, but let's try to sort through this. First and foremost, if you find yourself creating a bunch of PHP callback functions, get rid of them. Find out where they go. Find out the best place to put them. Object orientation is super slick, and it's a lot less clunky than the previous code and registration-driven models that existed in 7 and 6 and 5 and so on and so on. Drupal will autoload your own classes based on namespace and PSR 0 and 4. So if you get down this autoloading idea and you start to figure out where to put your objects, it's super easy, right? It's great. And that works for things like forms and block types and any of these custom entities that you might build for your own module. Get down these Symfony concepts like we talked about, containers, services, controllers, and that's all object-oriented too. So you're still staying on the reservation. It's pretty consistent in that regard. And plugins are super, super useful for swappable features. I have a slide that's dedicated to plugins here in just a few minutes. Hooks are still useful. Hooks are good for overriding runtime, but they don't replace plugins. Plugins are swappable features that you can use. I will describe them here in just a minute. How else do you fix this suck? First and foremost, for God's sakes, do not automate your porting. There are tools out there that are aimed, and their goal is to help you port modules. Okay, first and foremost, I kind of have a beef with this, and I'll tell you why. First, you should always aim to create a fresh Drupal 8 architecture. There is tons of new functionality that you want, and it does not map one-to-one to Drupal 7. It's brand new, and it's discretionary, right? So you cannot necessarily have a tool that assumes how you want it to be ported. I know that might strike people, but honestly, there's about 1,000 ways to skin a cat, right? I don't skin cats personally. But the point that I'm raising is that there is tons of new stuff that you should look at and evaluate on your own case-by-case basis. An automated tool does not do the justice of performing that activity, okay? So, and what happens? Well, okay, you can run a tool like this, and you can port one-to-one all the concepts that cleanly and articulately map from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. What happens with the rest? Guess what? It ships right over. And then what do? You spend your time going through and trying to clean up what it's left for you. Ugh, And yes, this does include your old and ugly procedural code that doesn't really work in Drupal 8, right? Hey. Your architectural discretion is what is going to make your module porting successful, not the automated tool. Plugin systems. Oh, guys, this is a really cool feature, okay? This is nice. My buddy wrote the plugin system for Drupal 8. He's crazy. Crazy cool, but he's crazy. So, all right, plugin systems. In Drupal 7, hooks were the way that you did everything, right? You register, like, I want this functionality to happen, but in Drupal 8, they're only runtime. So what happens for all the rest of the stuff that you would ever do with a hook? Well, there's kind of a model for that. It's either you can extend a core provided interface and put that in your source directory under a given directory, or you can use a plugin system. So a plugin system is awesome for allowing these adjustable options and features that you want to turn on or turn off within your module. Really cool. So in Drupal 7, there was like modules would try to do this on their own and create this like registration system, and like CTools had their own kind of registration. And the plugin system in Drupal 8 was kind of based on some concepts that were in CTools in Drupal 7, right? So you're not getting too far off the reservation from what people are used to, but it's object-oriented, so you kind of are. But one of the really kind of cool things, though, is these really help to reduce the hooks and create these swappable features. So the really nice part about it, let's say we've got a need. So I want any module that exists in Contrib or my own custom modules to be able to extend their own feature set into my module in a swappable way. Like you want to extend the options that are available for your Contrib module. So you need a way of registering that, and you need a way of being able to like load it and pull it and take advantage of it, right? I wrote password policy. So when I did password policy, you have this idea of these constraints, right? So in an example, I need a custom constraint type that my users must enter the word Bazinga in their passwords, right? So that's a custom use case. And how does password policy support that? Well, password policy ships with a bunch of default options. It says you can constrain it by length. Your password must be 10 characters. Or you can constrain it by character type. Your password must have 7 special characters in it. Okay? That's what it ships with. But Bazinga, does it ship with Bazinga? I don't think so. So how do you do that? Well, I wrote a plugin system that it made the types of constraints swappable. Any module can write their own, drop it in a directory that I define, and boom. They've got their own swappable option with Bazinga. Mr. Sheldon Cooper would be very happy. Entity basics. Okay, we talked a little bit about configuration and content entities. Let's get into a little bit more here. Drupal system objects are all entity driven. They have bundles, so you can categorize them by type, and whose configuration settings are stored via CMI and YAML. The expected code for this is all standard through different interfaces. You can write your own base classes to help bake in functionality that you want people to use by default. And you can do that with interfaces as well. I didn't mention that here. The metadata for your entities are all stored with annotations. So you can actually write your own annotation class to say what metadata you want for your entity and allow people to kind of take advantage of that. This is a much different paradigm to define. The schema that we talked about is a very, very radically different way of defining the attributes and the persistent storage of an entity. It's pretty crazy. So I highly recommend you guys like try to take a look at it and study it up a little bit more after. But all entities are extensible or exportable. Why did I say extensible there? That's crazy. Exportable via CMI and can be extended or overridden within a custom module. So for instance, if Drupal core ships with tons of entities, like user, right? That's a great example. So for password policy, I wanted to be able to write my own user fields for password related information, right? Like this person didn't update their password for 7 months, or this password should be expired. Those attributes belong to the user, right? They shouldn't be stored in a custom table. So what did I do? Well, because everything is CMI based, I was able to extend the user object and put those two new fields on the user. One other way to fix the suck, and this one is invital, if you can pull it off, is to find a mentor. Get somebody who you really trust that you know they know what they're doing. Hop on IRC, hop on Drupal Contribute, and have experts perform a code review and give you a walkthrough or give you feedback on what you've done. It'll make a world of difference. But people are going to ask you a lot of tough questions, so be prepared to hand them a document that describes what your goals are, what the features that you're building, and what your architecture was that you built around that. If you don't do that, you're going to just be floundering. You'll have a conversation, people will be like, I don't understand any of this. Drupal console. Drupal console is an awesome tool. So who's heard of Drush? Okay. Drupal console is similar to Drush, except Drush runs on a live site. Drush is performing operations on a running Drupal site. Drupal console writes code or changes or adjusts configuration, which is code, right? So Drupal console helps with basically performing code generation functions. Now, one would say, why is this a part of fixing the suck? You don't have to learn how to write every single stupid thing in Drupal 8. Use console. You don't have to do it by hand. It's awesome. It's a super, super easy and quick way for you to say, oh, I need a new entity. Boom, 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 console. I need a new form. Boom, 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 console. Really nice. It also works for controllers and routes, by the way. FYI. Now, one other way. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I just haven't used Drupal console before. So you're saying that it generates the files and puts them in the right places?
Yes, it does.
Like so it's for development and like you said, not for a live site.
Yep.
And okay.
Yeah. No, it's actually really cool. It's super easy. It's if you want an automated way to do any sort of code, that's the way to go. Very, very slick. So the question was posed earlier, well, how do you figure it out if you can't read Drupal.org docs or you can't read blog posts? Well, look, you have to study core. I know that sounds crazy. It is the only thing that is up to date. That's what's being worked on. At this point in time, studying core is extremely useful for looking at examples of how you build similar functionality. What is the quick and dirty way to do this? Well, you go into Drupal, you install it, and you find something that resembles what you're looking for. It might not be perfect, right? But maybe there's a menu block type, right? And you kind of want some similar, you want your own block type. So you're like, I see this. So go dig around core. Try to find where that code is defined. And the more that you learn that stuff, you'll start to pick things up a lot faster, right? So core is actually really, really good for looking at these design patterns. Super useful for like seeing how you actually should build things. It has tons of examples, right? One other really cool thing that you can do is actually look at automated tests. They literally walk through exactly how things should work, right? And that's a really quick and dirty way for you to see exactly how things kind of work and how they behave in Drupal 8. And then basically, the way that you can do that is kind of like you can shoot out a wide net and try to look for code that you want and then just drill down, right? So you may want to say like, oh, okay, well, what module provides like this type of functionality? Then you found the module and you could look in and do a code review of that specific module itself. So it can be tough when you're just starting out to try to kind of get your bearings on that, but core is definitely a place to go at this point in time. Contrib tracker. So before you do anything in the contrib space, and we talked about looking at Drupal.org for the issue queues and things like that. There's a brand new project that's up. It's called Contrib Tracker. And the goal of Contrib Tracker is to try to give you a short summary of where a module is in Drupal 8. So if you're curious about views in Drupal 8, well, guess what? It was moved into core. If you're curious about, say, password policy, well, I went in and updated that last week. And I said, it's on Drupal.org too, right? So if you want a quick and dirty way when you're doing some analysis of doing site building or looking at your old contributed modules that you want for a new D8 site, that's the way you do it. But it's very useful for doing audits, and that would be helpful if you don't want to waste your time porting something that might already exist. Automated testing. I highly recommend that you guys do this, and the reason for that is because it's a community, right? I mean, people are going to want to pitch in on things. You're going to be doing continuous development on your projects and things like that. If you have automated tests, you can see what breaks, period. That's a no-brainer. And there are plenty, I left some examples on the slide, you could look at it later. There are plenty of ways that Drupal 8 and its auxiliary tools are there to help support your mission for that. PHP Storm. PHP Storm is fully object-oriented PHP coding tool. Works perfectly with Drupal 8 from what I've seen thus far. Has a lot of really nice features. It can interpret the annotations that we talked about. It supports PHP Code Sniffer and the coding standards. It has integration with Git and code repos. You can do easy discovery if you're in a file and you hold down a control button and you click on any classes, it pulls up its source. There's a lot of really nice kind of tools specifically for object orientation that make things a lot easier and a lot faster. You could also do wildcard searching. I love that feature. Advanced concepts. Yes, sir.
Sorry.
No problem.
So PHP Storm is an alternative to Eclipse or something like that.
Yeah, it's actually very similar.
So
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's more targeted for like
For
PHP.
rather than Java.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
precisely. Yep. Okay, so some advanced concepts. So this is where, we talked a lot about the basics. We talked a lot about entities. We talked about the, mostly conceptual. Well, let's get into the really nitty gritty. Controller services entities, oh my. It's so frightening. So where do you put your code? Well, it depends. First and foremost, controllers are for rendering logic only. Okay, that makes it easy. If you're not doing any sort of bridge between a rendering system, you don't need a controller. Services. This holds more complex code, but it's code that is generically available to Drupal, right? To all of Drupal. So you're opening up an interface called Drupal get my service, and then whatever functions you want, like encrypt. So that's cool. And lastly, we talked a lot about entities, right? You can put code in with entities. So any operations that are associated to an actual entity should be in the class, right? It shouldn't be in a service, it shouldn't be in a controller or a custom callback. So an example of that, we actually talked about building the menu tree out from a taxonomy menu, right? That belongs to a taxonomy menu entity. Hooks versus extended classes. We've kind of talked a lot about this. Hooks are not replaced, they're just runtime. People would say, coming from like a pure object-oriented background, why can't I just write a class that replaces a hook? The reason is because extending a class does not provide any context about other extended classes. So in Drupal, right, you have this idea where a hook can, any module can tap into a hook. And it's runtime based, right? But a class, extending a class, there's no other context about all the other modules that are trying to do the same exact thing you are. So then what class gets called? Who knows? You can't figure it out, right? So that's not how object orientation works. So really, you still have hooks. Event subscribers. Okay, so this is a Symfony concept. This is kind of cool. So a lot of people want to use like hook init for really super, super low level stuff in Drupal 7. Well, you don't have that in Drupal 8, I don't think. You might, but one of the really cool ways is you could leverage a Symfony concept called an event subscriber. An event subscriber is basically at a kernel level, it says, anytime you have an event that happens in Drupal, that could be a page request, that could be, like a whole bunch of different things, right? You could write your own event subscriber in your module, check for certain contexts, and write your own logic very, very low level. You could override all of Drupal at that point. Kind of neat. So the way that I used it was I forced whenever a password was supposed to be reset, I would check to see who the user was when they were trying to access a page, and I would force them to go to their reset, their user profile form, if their password needed to be reset. And I did it before they could access any page. And I did it from a very, very low level. So it was performant, right? I didn't have to wait till Drupal fully bootstrapped either. It's kind of cool. Contexts. Contexts are a brand new concept in Drupal 8. And this is going to drive people nuts, I think. But it's actually really nice. This is kind of black magic. So baked into a lot of Drupal's requests and responses and things like that are this idea of context. And a context is exactly what it says it is. It is an attribute of a request, or it's an attribute of a response. And that context can help for other modules to understand what parts of Drupal are impacted by a request. So a great example, like you've got user, and then you've got this like token, right? Edit. So this would be like user 3 edit, user 4 edit, right? But the idea is that this user thing, right, which is kind of a token, is meant to respond to a user entity, right? There is black magic that has all of these things defined in a list. And anytime you provide them as part of your routing system, or you say, I'm expecting this context, it will somehow try to determine that within Drupal from your request. So anytime that you're doing things that, you're extending functionality, you can leverage context to try to bring in other system functionality that already exists. And if you want to write your own, you could do that too. So it's a little bit crazy, but anytime that you want to retrieve your context, there's a function called getContext that's part of the request and response. And it just will automatically bring everything that is ever found about that request and say, here you go. Magic. Dependency injection. Okay, so this is really, really, really nerdy. But it's kind of cool. So this is a really good thing for performance, and this is really good convention when you're writing dependencies into your code. So one really cool thing that you could do is you could do it from a constructor in your classes, and you could say, anytime you call this class, you should expect these dependencies. And those are other system objects that you have. The approach number 2 is you have a service. And that service needs certain parts of Drupal to run. So you can use dependency injection to define those, and it's super, super performant. You do that in the registration, and it caches all of the requests. It builds those request objects for you. Derivers, this one's like super, super low level. It's basically a bridge between different parts of the system. So you can write derivers that are intended to bridge taxonomies and menus, right? Or, with services, we wrote a bridge for retrieving an entity and returning a service response. So it's logic that sits between two things that otherwise wouldn't have any way to communicate with each other. Now, this one is definitely an advanced concept. I'm not expecting people to be running into this all the time, but be aware that it exists. Composer. So Composer is also cool because you've got a bunch of open source tools that your module may want to use. Well, the really nice thing about Composer in Drupal 8 is that you can leverage Composer Manager, the module, the contrib module, and you could write all of the libraries that you would want for your module in its Composer JSON file. That gets brought into core, gets loaded in, and everybody's happy. So it's much more open source friendly. Composer's nice. And that's everybody's happy. So an example of that for encrypt, I wrote a submodule called encrypt seclib. Seclib is, PHP seclib is a replacement for some of the PHP out-of-the-box encryption libraries. It's on Composer, brought it in, shipped it in, wrote a plugin for my encryption system. Donezo. Everybody's happy. Thank you, folks. I covered a lot of ground in a lot of time. Thanks again.